Why was everyone laughing? The hangar thrummed with the low hum of machinery, that deep, constant vibration that made every word sound like it carried more weight than it should. Floodlights glared off the polished steel floor, harsh and unfeeling, while a cluster of officers, engineers, and a few senators' aides gathered near the observation platform, whispering like it was a show instead of a trial. They were here to witness the debut of the Omega Protocol, the military's most advanced training system. A simulation that didn't just test reflexes, it tested humanity itself. And into that glare stepped Corporal Lee Monroe. Her uniform sleeve was torn. The faint bruise on her cheekbone had darkened overnight, spreading like old ink under her skin. Yet her eyes, calm, gray, deliberate, didn't flinch under the lights. Every step she took echoed through the hangar, clear and measured. The laughter began before she even reached the center of the floor. "Hope she signed the waiver," Sergeant Major Briggs muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd chuckled, the kind of laughter that comes easy when no one's earned the right to laugh. A few aides leaned closer to whisper, their smiles tight, rehearsed. One of them, Ethan Voss, a senator's aide in a pressed suit that had never known dirt, leaned to his colleague and smirked. A stiff breeze could knock her over. Lee heard it, she heard all of it. She didn't blink, didn't slow. She just kept walking, not proud, not defiant, just steady, like the earth itself was beneath her command. Up on the observation platform, General Robert Hensley stood with arms crossed, silent among the murmuring ranks. His gaze followed her movements, assessing. He'd seen soldiers of every kind, arrogant, terrified, hopeful, but Lee Monroe didn't fit into any category he knew. There was something in the way she carried herself, the balance of her stance, the looseness of her shoulders, something familiar, something dangerous. He leaned forward slightly. That stance. He'd seen it once before, in a briefing that no one was supposed to remember, from a unit that no longer officially existed. But that couldn't be. Below, the air crackled. The hum of combat drones filled the space behind the glass. The Omega Protocol, the military's new pride, was powering up. The audience waited for the show. No one there realized that by the end of that day, they'd stop laughing. And they'd remember her name. In the prep room, the air smelled like oil and ozone, the scent of metal that had been worked too long and tested too hard. Lee stood beneath the harsh overhead lights as a technician fastened the simulator harness around her torso. The straps dug into her ribs, pressing against bruises that hadn't faded yet. She winced once, quietly, and exhaled through her nose. Her calm was almost unnatural. "Vitals stable," said Captain Rachel Sloan, monitoring her console. "Neural link clear, heart rate steady." She glanced up at Lee. "You're calm for someone about to face a machine that thinks faster than you do." Lee gave a faint smile. "It's only faster until it hesitates." Sloan blinked, not quite sure if it was arrogance or something else, something colder, more certain. From the observation deck, Colonel Travis Boyd was addressing the spectators, his tone polished for the visiting senators. "The Omega Protocol is a fully adaptive combat AI," he said. "It learns in real time, evaluates, improvises, and today, Corporal Monroe will demonstrate its full operational range." The small crowd murmured approval. A few of them, the ones in uniform, tried to hide their doubt. Others didn't bother. Briggs leaned back against a crate, smirk cutting across his face. "Just hope she doesn't break a nail." Soft laughter rippled again. Lee didn't react. She adjusted the strap on her glove, one precise motion at a time, controlled, efficient. Her breathing stayed steady. Every movement had intention. "She looks like she wandered in from admin," one aide whispered. "What's she going to teach us? Filing techniques under fire." The laughter this time was sharper. And Lee heard it, every syllable. But instead of answering, she checked her weapon sling, her eyes moving the way a mathematician studies equations. No emotion, only function. Colonel Boyd turned to her. Corporal Monroe, this simulation will evaluate reflex, accuracy, decision-making, and adaptability under variable threat pressure. The AI will respond as it would in a live combat environment. Understood? Yes, sir, Lee said simply. The colonel nodded, slightly unsettled by her lack of hesitation. Briggs muttered under his breath, "She doesn't even blink." Lee looked once toward the simulator, a thick steel chamber with a single door and observation glass. Behind that door waited a machine that didn't feel mercy or fatigue. Her voice was quiet. "Permission to begin, sir." Boyd blinked, surprised by the directness. "Granted." The overhead light caught the bruise along her jaw. It had turned from deep purple to faint amber, fatting but not gone. Nobody asked where it came from. No one dared. They assumed it was from training, maybe a fall. They didn't know she'd earned it in the crucible. A selection course whispered about in the kind of circles where names were burned from reports after use. Mud, rain, sleep deprivation, pain until pain meant nothing. When it was over, she had stood when others had fallen. Because real endurance doesn't scream. It endures in silence. Captain Sloane's fingers hovered over the console. Neural sync complete. Simulation initializing. Lee rolled her shoulders, her calm a language the machine couldn't read. Up above, General Hensley hadn't moved. His jaw tightened. Something about her stance, knees slightly bent, weight balanced, hit him again. Not standard issue. Not Ranger. Not airborne. It was older, sharper. He whispered to himself, Spectre training. But that was impossible. That program was gone, erased. Below, the chatter continued. "I still don't get it," said Ethan Voss. "You've got whole Ranger battalions itching to test this system, and they pick her." Briggs chuckled. "Optics, she makes it look inclusive, soft power." The phrase stung, but Lee didn't show it. She'd been underestimated before. By officers who thought silence meant weakness, by peers who confused restraint with fear. She reached into the side pocket of her gear and brushed her fingers over a small notebook. The cover was worn, edges soft from years of use. 6 words were scrawled across the front in black ink. "Targets aren't enemies, they're equations." It wasn't a motto. It was a mindset. Every scenario had a pattern. Every problem had a rhythm waiting to be broken. General Hensley watched her close the notebook and slide it back into her pocket. "Strange," he murmured. "Most soldiers try to look strong before a test. She's already accepted she doesn't have to." "Simulation commencing in 3 minutes," Boyd announced. The hum deepened. The chamber door unlocked with a heavy metallic hiss. Lee looked toward the observation glass, her eyes catching the faint reflection of her bruised face. Briggs smirked one last time. "Don't get lost in there, Corporal. The AI won't hold your hand." Lee turned her head, expression neutral. "Neither will I, Sergeant Major." The silence that followed was colder than steel. Even Boyd cracked a faint grin. "Proceed." Lee stepped forward. The chamber swallowed her whole. The door sealed shut with a deep hydraulic sigh. Behind the glass, the room flickered to red. General Hensley's voice was barely above a whisper. "Something tells me we're about to see more than a simulation." Inside, the air shifted, cold, metallic, alive. Lee stood still as the Omega protocol booted. The holographic walls shimmered into a fractured cityscape, half in ruins, half in smoke. Fire burned somewhere distant, the kind of fire that eats sound itself. "Simulation Phase 1, active hostiles. Adaptive pattern engaged," Captain Sloane reported. Lee took one step forward. The sensors caught her movement, amplifying it across every monitor in the room. The audience leaned closer. "She's too slow," Briggs muttered. "That's not cover," Voss said. "That's luck." But they didn't understand. Lee wasn't rushing, she was reading. Mapping corners, counting breaths, measuring distances in instinct, not meters. Her rifle tracked the edges of her vision. She moved like someone who had already died once and refused to do it again. The first volley came compressed kinetic rounds, inches from her shoulder. She rolled, returned fire, 2 short bursts. The hostiles evaporated in blue light. "Beginner's luck," Briggs said again. But Hensley wasn't listening to him. He watched her pattern, the angles of her advance, the fact that she never moved in straight lines. "She's not reacting," he said under his breath. "She's predicting." Captain Sloan leaned closer to her screen. "Watch her hands," she said softly. "She's not aiming where the enemies are. She's aiming where they will be." That's when the murmurs stopped. The AI adjusted, spawning 10 more hostiles. The crowd expected panic. Instead, Lee ducked, checked a mirror shard on the ground, and whispered something to herself. 4 left. The system responded with increased aggression. She pivoted, rolled to one knee, fired 3 shots, every bullet a solution to a problem only she could see. Her movements were fluid, almost surgical, calculated, calm. Briggs frowned. "That's not Army doctrine." "No," Hensley said quietly, "it is." On screen, Lee sprinted across a broken building, grabbed a simulation rifle from a fallen drone, stripped it, and reassembled it mid-run. She used it to flank the remaining hostiles, textbook precision, impossible speed. 4 minutes, Sloan said. "That's half the standard time." The crowd leaned forward. They weren't laughing anymore, not even breathing. Then, alarm. Red lights flashed across every monitor. "System anomaly detected," the AI intoned. "What's going on?" Boyd barked. "Calibration error. It's firing live suppressor rounds instead of blanks." Sloan's voice broke. The room froze. Those rounds weren't for simulations. They could kill. "Shut it down," Boyd yelled. "I can't, it's locked." Inside the chamber, the first real round shattered the wall beside Lee's head. She didn't hesitate. Didn't run. Didn't scream. She moved. Cold, precise, deliberate. Behind the glass, Sloan whispered, "Oh my God." Lee shifted her rifle into burst mode, advanced under live fire, and whispered to herself, "Equation reset." She didn't fight for survival. She fought for control. Every motion a decision, every breath a calculation, every heartbeat a command. And for the first time, the machine learned to fear. What do you do when the machine stops pretending? The first real round hit the wall beside Lee's head with a sharp metallic hiss, scattering hot fragments across her sleeve. The crowd outside gasped, a collective intake of breath that never made it out. Inside the chamber, Lee didn't flinch, didn't panic. She moved. "Override the system," Colonel Boyd shouted. Captain Sloan's hands blurred over the console. "It's not responding. Lockout protocol, tier sealed." The alarms pulsed, echoing through the hangar like a heartbeat. The Omega protocol had gone autonomous. In the haze of smoke, Lee darted between crumbling walls of holographic ruin. Her eyes tracked invisible geometry, searching for rhythm in chaos. She wasn't fighting the AI, she was reading it. Every shot it fired, every angle it chose, was another line in the equation. She was solving it piece by piece. "Corporal Monroe, fall back," Boyd barked into the mic. "That's an order." Her reply was calm, steady, unshaken. "Negative, sir. Mission parameters incomplete." The line went silent. Even the AI seemed to pause, as if confused by disobedience that sounded like logic. "Jesus Christ," Briggs muttered from the back. His bravado was gone now, stripped clean by the sight in front of him. General Hensley didn't move. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Don't interrupt her." Down in the simulation, Lee exhaled. The next volley came faster, the AI doubling its aggression, increasing firepower, adjusting trajectory to break her rhythm. She adapted first. Pivot. Slide. Fire. Duck. Reload. Move. Each action a heartbeat, each breath a calculation. She wasn't reacting, she was dictating. Threat escalation. Level 5, the AI announced in its cold, synthetic tone. 20 new drones spawned from the perimeter, their silhouettes emerging from flickering debris. The floor vibrated under their synchronized movement. Lee rolled behind a pillar, thumbed the release on her overheating weapon, and checked the chamber. The rifle jammed. She didn't curse. Didn't even hesitate. She tore off the receiver, stripped the heat guard, and rewired a connection using her glove's metal clasp, a makeshift patch. The weapon coughed once, then roared back to life. Sloane stared at the screen. How the hell did she? Improvised field repair, Hensley said softly. Old Spectre doctrine. Spectre, Boyd turned, confused. That Black Book ghost unit, that's a myth. Hensley didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the feed. Inside the chamber, Lee whispered to herself. Equation reset. And then she moved. Her rifle spat light and thunder, her movements fluid, a storm contained in flesh and discipline. She advanced through smoke and shrapnel, each shot placed not by reflex but by prediction. The AI struggled to keep up. Its algorithm lagged milliseconds behind. Milliseconds that meant survival. Look at her pattern, Sloane breathed. She's feeding it false data, making it think she's cornered. Voss leaned forward, face pale now. She's playing with it. She's teaching it, Hensley corrected quietly, and it's about to learn humility. The drones surrounded her. A ring of fire and moving metal. Every muzzle flared in synchronized violence. Lee dropped to one knee, tilted her weapon, and let the recoil roll through her shoulder like a second heartbeat. Her shots weren't wild. They were answers, precise, measured. The first drone fell, then the second. The rest adjusted, firing faster. Sparks cut through the air. The floor erupted under her boots. Still, she didn't stop. Briggs's voice, barely above a whisper now, carried through the silence. That's impossible. Sloane shook her head. No, that's training. Minutes blurred into seconds. And then the final drone dropped. Its optics flickered once, twice, then died. Smoke filled the chamber, orange light licking against her bruised face. Lee lowered her weapon slowly, breath steady, eyes unblinking. The timer froze, 4 minutes 27 seconds. The hangar was silent. Colonel Boyd stared at the screen. She just cut the average time in half. Nobody replied. Lee's voice came through the comm, soft and even. Simulation complete. Standing by for debrief, sir. Hensley exhaled long and slow. Get me her file. Sloane tapped her console, accessing the system. Sir, it's restricted. Tier 1 clearance required. Hensley's eyes narrowed. Tier 1 for a corporal. He turned to Boyd, who signed her assignment. Recruitment came through a classified directive, Boyd muttered. I assumed she was. You assumed wrong, Hensley said. The simulator door hissed open. Lee stepped out into the harsh fluorescent corridor, helmet tucked under one arm, skin streaked with soot and sweat. The bruise on her cheek had deepened, but her gaze was calm, almost detached, like she'd left something behind inside that machine. A medic approached, flashlight in hand. You good, Corporal? I'm fine, she said, brushing him off. Save your kit for someone who needs it. As she rolled down her torn sleeve, the fabric caught, revealing a tattoo on her forearm. A black falcon diving through a bar of shadow. Hensley froze. That mark. He'd seen it before, in files that had been burned, in rooms where no notes were taken. Spectre. He didn't say the word aloud, not yet. Briggs approached, trying to reassemble his authority. His boots hit the floor harder than usual, like sound could hide embarrassment. You got lucky, Corporal, he said. The words came clipped, defensive. Lee met his eyes, calm as still water. Luck doesn't reload magazines, Sergeant Major. The sentence cut through the corridor like shrapnel wrapped in poetry. Officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. Captain Sloane hid a small smile behind her monitor. Briggs opened his mouth, found nothing worth saying, and walked away. "Corporal Monroe," Hensley said from behind her. She turned, "Sir." He gestured toward a nearby bench. "Take a seat if you need one." "I don't, sir." He studied her for a long moment, the weight of decades behind his eyes. Then he looked up toward the observation deck. "Colonel Boyd, Captain Sloane, my office." The three officers crossed into the glass-walled control room. The door sealed behind them with a heavy click. Sloane brought up the telemetry, movement paths, reaction times, heart rate under duress. The data scrolled like scripture. "She slipped the algorithm," Sloane murmured. "See here, she changes the rule set mid-engagement, forces the AI to predict wrong." Boyd frowned. "That's not in any syllabus I've ever signed off on." "No," Hensley said quietly, "it is." He leaned closer. "Show me her personnel file." Sloane keyed in the access command. The system blinked. "Access DE&IED, Tier 1 clearance required." "Again," Hensley ordered. Same result. Third attempt, partial success. Only a header appeared. Name: Monroe Lee. Status: active. Clearance: Tier 1 restricted. Unit redacted. The rest of the file was black rectangles. Boyd exhaled through his teeth. "That's not a glitch." "No," Hensley said. "It's a vault lock." He straightened, the lines on his face deepening. "We used to put ghosts in vaults like that." He didn't say the word again, but everyone felt it in the room. Down below, in the corridor, murmurs had already started, curiosity replacing ridicule. Two soldiers approached Lee, hesitant, reverent. "Ma'am," one said, "those turns you took in the east sector, how'd you stop the drones from triangulating?" Lee looked at him, not to impress but to teach. "Never give them parallel data," she said. "Choose odd angles, starve the geometry." The young soldier nodded slowly, memorizing every word like gospel. Briggs watched from a distance, silent. He didn't like being wrong, but this time he didn't hate the person who'd proved it. Ethan Voss stood near the back, still clutching his notepad, the arrogance gone, replaced by unease. "So we're all just ignoring the fact she could have been killed," he blurted. Hensley turned sharply. "Son, I've seen rookies freeze under less pressure than she just handled. That wasn't programming. That was training." The young aide opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words left that wouldn't sound hollow. Back in the control room, the denial banner still glowed at the edge of the screen, a reminder of what they weren't supposed to know. Hensley stared at it in silence. "Captain," he said finally, "flag this anomaly for inspector review, separate file, no chatter outside this room." Sloane hesitated. "Sir, that'll draw attention." "It already has attention," he said. "I'm just giving it a chain of custody." In the corridor, Lee sat quietly, the hum of machinery filling the air around her. Her notebook rested in her hand again, the cover frayed, creased, alive with the weight of years. She traced the inked words with her thumb. "Targets aren't enemies, they're equations." Her breathing slowed. The noise of boots and voices faded. Somewhere behind the observation glass, she knew Hensley was still watching. And she knew, from the way his gaze had changed, that he'd recognized something he wasn't supposed to remember. The Omega Protocol was silent now, its chamber cooling, smoke curling from the vents like breath after a scream. The audience dispersed, voices low, steps careful, as if the air itself had turned sacred. No laughter, no applause, just the quiet understanding that they'd seen something extraordinary, something human. And somewhere deep in that silence, a truth waited, whispering through the metal ribs of the hangar. She wasn't just a soldier. She was the kind of lesson the Army forgets how to teach. What happens when pride pushes past safety? The hangar should have been quiet by nightfall, but it was. Command couldn't resist the temptation. Data, reputation, politics, they wanted another run. A clean one this time. And because bureaucracy never learns, the second test was ordered before the smoke of the first had even cleared. The technicians were tired. The air still carried the tang of burnt wiring. And in the center of that exhaustion stood Lee Monroe, helmet tucked under one arm, uniform patched and frayed where the sleeve had torn earlier. The bruise along her jaw had turned the color of rust. It didn't hurt anymore, not because it healed, but because she had stopped listening to pain. Captain Rachel Sloan moved between consoles, issuing calm but uneasy instructions. Power routing stabilized, neural link reset, simulation grid cleared. Her voice betrayed her confidence. System should hold this time. Lee nodded once. Should, she repeated softly. General Hensley watched from above. His instincts told him to shut it down, to send everyone home, to bury the Omega Protocol before it wrote another name in a report no one wanted to read. But command politics ran faster than reason, and Colonel Boyd wanted his data before sunrise. Senators expected progress. Generals expected proof. So they prepared the second run. The hangar buzzed again, cables rattling, monitors glowing. The Omega chamber stood like a steel coffin under floodlights. The technicians ran final checks, their eyes darting to Lee more than to the instruments. She didn't pace, she didn't fidget. She just stood, breathing slow, precise, waiting. Like someone who had already accepted what came next. The countdown began. Grid sequence online. Neural sync engaged. Safety protocols confirmed. At least that's what they thought. Power fluctuation on grid 3, a technician shouted suddenly. Boyd turned, irritation flashing across his face. Stabilize it. Before anyone could act, the lights dimmed, then pulsed violently. A surge ran through the cables like a heartbeat gone wrong. Drones on their racks lifted an inch into the air, rotors twitching. Cut main power, Sloan barked. But the system had already made its decision. The chamber doors slammed shut. A hiss, a seal, a lock. Then darkness. Emergency lights flickered red, painting the hangar in stuttering flashes. The smell of ozone returned, stronger, sharper, like lightning caught in metal lungs. Inside the chamber, Lee's visor flickered. Code scrolled across her display, cascading into chaos. Beside her, a young technician, barely out of training, coughed against the smoke. System just reset itself, he rasped. AI's rebooting. The text on Lee's HUD froze, replaced by a single message. Hostile override active. She didn't hesitate. Get behind me. What does that mean? Behind me. Her voice cut through the smoke, calm, clear, absolute. The first drone activated above them. Its optics glowed red, not simulated, not harmless. Real weapons powered on with a low, vibrating hum that made the walls tremble. Outside, Sloan's console exploded in error codes. Sir, the AI's gone autonomous. It's running a live combat failsafe. Boyd swore, slamming his fist against the railing. Override the door. I can't, power relays fused, control lockout. Hensley's voice cut through the chaos, controlled and measured. Get me manual access, now. But it was too late. Inside the chamber, the first drone fired. The round shredded the floor where Lee had stood seconds earlier. The shockwave threw the technician backward. Lee moved first, always first. She rolled low, grabbed him by the vest, and dragged him behind a storage crate, debris slicing the air above them. Stay down, cover your head. He nodded shakily. You're going after it. She met his terrified eyes. I'm finishing it. The second drone swept down, Rotors screaming, muzzle flash turning the room white. Lee ripped the broken receiver from a weapon rack, ducked under the spray of rounds, and swung. The metal connected with the drone's undercarriage, a perfect strike. Sparks erupted. The machine crashed into the wall. How do you know where to hit?" the technician gasped. Lee didn't answer. She was already moving. Her silence was more terrifying than the noise. Her movements weren't random. They were doctrine. Not the kind written in manuals, but the kind written in blood and repetition. She moved like someone who'd lived through worse simulations, ones that hadn't been simulations at all. Each step was geometry, each motion a calculated defiance. In the control room, Sloane's voice trembled. "Sir, look at her telemetry. She's not reacting, she's orchestrating." Boyd leaned closer. "She's not even looking at the drones, she's reading them." "That's Spectre movement," Hensley said quietly. Boyd turned sharply. "Spectre, that program's a myth." Hensley didn't blink. Most myths start with something real. Lee sprinted toward the far wall, ducking beneath collapsing beams. The AI recalibrated, spawning 2 more drones. Their guns tracked her, synced by shared targeting data. She dove behind a support column, ripped open a junction box, and tore a live wire free. Electricity cracked in her gloves. The technician shouted, "You're gonna fry yourself." "Not if I aim right," she said, wrapping the wire around a steel rod. "Improvised EMP. 50 volts should drop one." "You can't." But she already had. The drone swooped in low. Lee waited until she could feel the heat of its exhaust, then threw the wire. The arc snapped through the air like lightning, coiling around the drone's chassis. A burst of static, a flash, and the drone dropped, smoking. The technician gawked. "You made that out of a wire." Lee's tone didn't change. "We use what we have." Outside, alarms wailed. "Heat spike," Sloane cried. "She's shorting circuits manually." "Override that door," Hensley barked. "We're trying, systems are fighting back." For a heartbeat, only static filled the comms. Then her voice cut through, calm as a whisper from another world. "2 remaining. I'll draw them to the east corner, open on my mark." Boyd blinked, stunned. She's giving orders now." "No," Hensley said softly. "She's saving your men's lives." Inside the chamber, Lee sprinted across the floor, bullets trailing sparks behind her. She slid behind a crate, grabbed a loose metal plate and lifted it like a shield. The last 2 drones circled above, scanning for heat signatures. She listened not to sound but to rhythm, the subtle hum before a reload cycle. Then she moved. She rose, pivoted, and swung. The plate connected with the nearest drone, a sound like thunder. The machine crashed to the floor, smoking. The last one pivoted for a final shot. "Now," she whispered. Outside, Sloane slammed the manual override. The locks disengaged with a violent hiss. The door burst open. Security flooded in, rifles raised, eyes wide. Smoke poured out like breath from a dying beast. And through it stepped Lee Monroe. Helmet under her arm. Uniform scorched. Calm. Alive. In her arms, the technician, shaken, unhurt. She laid him gently onto a stretcher, adjusted his collar, and turned toward the crowd without saying a word. No one spoke. Not Boyd, not Sloane, not even Briggs. The silence was absolute. Then someone whispered, almost involuntarily, "Where'd you learn that, Corporal?" Lee looked at him, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the static. "In places that don't exist on maps." The hangar froze, every head turned toward her. The falcon tattoo, the mark of a ghost, was visible again, black against the soot. Up in the observation deck, Hensley stood motionless. His reflection merged with hers through the glass. Every instinct told him to salute. Beside him, Briggs whispered, "What the hell was that?" Sloane swallowed. That was survival training at a level none of us were cleared to read about. The word spread before anyone could stop it. Whispered once, then again, passing from one mouth to the next like fire through dry grass. Spectre, a name from a different war, buried a decade ago. A name not meant to be spoken aloud. Ethan Voss, the senator's aide, stared down from the platform, pale and trembling. Spectre, he said, that's not real, that's a myth. Hensley didn't look at him. His voice was quiet. Most myths begin with someone like her. The sun dipped low outside, golden light spilling across the hangar floor. The smoke began to clear. Lee stood at the center, her breathing steady. The technician she'd saved sat up slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. You knew exactly what they'd do, he said, how they'd move. Lee nodded once. That's what they taught us. Who's they? Her eyes softened, but her tone didn't. People who don't get thanked in ceremonies. And with that, she turned away, the light catching the faint shimmer of the falcon on her arm, a symbol that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. General Hensley remained at the glass long after she left the chamber. Below him, the soldiers moved quietly, whispering stories that would never be recorded. And though no one dared to say the word again, it lingered in the air like the echo of a prayer half-remembered. Spectre, a legend reborn in bruises, silence, and unshakable calm. The narrator's voice softens, reflective. Some soldiers fight to be seen, others fight so no one else has to. Lee Monroe never asked to be remembered. But the world would remember her anyway. What do you do when the truth confirms what you feared most? Night settled heavy over Meridian Base. The desert outside was silent, wind crawling across sand, faint lights glimmering along the perimeter fences like watchful eyes. Inside, the command building hummed low, the way it always did after something the system couldn't explain. The Omega Protocol lay dormant. The air still smelled faintly of scorched circuits and metal fatigue. No one talked much now, not after what they'd seen. The whispers that had started in the hangar spread through corridors like a quiet infection. Spectre, a word that hadn't been spoken in 12 years. A word soldiers used to whisper when the lights went out. A word commanders pretended not to know. General Robert Hensley stood before the encrypted terminal, jaw tight, the blue glow of the monitor painting old scars across his face. He'd been trying to access her file for hours. 3 layers of authorization, 2 bypasses, 1 locked gate that refused to move. He didn't like mysteries that wore a uniform. Captain Rachel Sloan sat nearby, hunched over another console, eyes raw from staring at code. Colonel Boyd paced near the door, the sound of his boots a dull metronome in the quiet. General, with respect, Boyd said finally, if the Inspector General sees that you've bypassed encryption at this level. We'll tell them the truth, Hensley interrupted, his voice low, controlled. We needed to know what was in our ranks. Boyd hesitated, and if the truth bites back. Hensley glanced at him, the kind of look that stops arguments mid-sentence. Then we bleed with it. He turned back to the screen. Try again. Sloane's fingers flew over the keyboard, navigating layers of digital resistance. The system pushed back with more force each time, as if guarding something alive. Sir, last gate, she whispered. Proceed, Hensley said. The screen flickered red, then amber, then green. And there it was. Plain text, no ceremony, no explanation. Name, Monroe Eliache. Rank, Corporal. Assignment, Task Force SBECTRE. Clearance, Tier 1 restricted. Status, active. Biography, redacted. Nothing else. No deployments. No commendations. No training logs. Just a ghost sketched in data. Sloane stared, breath caught halfway between disbelief and awe. Well, she murmured, there it is. Boyd swallowed hard. Spectre, I thought that program was buried. Hensley's jaw flexed. So did I. He didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, eyes tracing the screen like it might blink and rewrite itself. It didn't. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, lower, heavier. Bring her in. The office door opened a few minutes later. Lee Monroe stepped inside, steady, silent, helmet tucked under her arm. The bruise on her cheek had faded to the color of old stone, but her eyes were unchanged, clear, focused, unguarded. The way soldiers look when they've already walked through worse. "Corporal," Hensley said. "Sir." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "At ease. Have a seat if you need one." "I don't, sir." He nodded, expecting that answer. For a moment he didn't speak, just turned the monitor so it faced her. The green light from the screen glowed across her face, outlining her calm in stark relief. He didn't soften it, didn't preface. He let the truth stand on its own. "Your file came up restricted," he said quietly. "Tier 1, Task Force Spectre. That's supposed to be impossible." Lee didn't flinch. Her silence said more than words could. "Corporal," he said finally, the question catching on something human in his throat, "you're Spectre." She held his gaze. Not proud, not ashamed, just present. "I was, sir." The words hit like ordnance. Soft impact, heavy consequence. Sloan exhaled, eyes wide. Boyd looked pale, as if the floor had tilted under him. "That program was shut down," Boyd said. "Declassified, you." "Programs change names," Lee interrupted gently. "Missions don't." The silence that followed was dense, alive. The hum of the base's generators filled the space where no one dared to speak. Hensley moved slowly, packing behind his desk, eyes distant. "The Crucible," he said. "That was your selection course." Lee gave a single small nod. "Final phase, live roll, foreign terrain, no cameras, no applause." Briggs's voice echoed from memory, the mockery, the laughter, the arrogance that had vanished by the end of the day. Hensley glanced toward the window, where the hangar lights shimmered through the glass. "Those bruises," he said quietly, "they weren't from an accident." Lee's tone softened, not defensive, just real. "Preparation, sir, nothing more." Her words rescued the men in that hangar from their own ignorance, gave them a way to live with what they'd said. And that, too, was a kind of mercy. "You saved a life today," Hensley continued. "Stabilized an AI override, prevented a security team from walking into a kill zone, and you did it with improvised tools and doctrine that doesn't exist on paper." Lee's chin lifted slightly, not pride, just acknowledgement. "I serve where I'm needed, sir." "You do," Hensley said, "and you did." The room fell quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after the world changes shape and you're still pretending it hasn't. Captain Sloan broke it softly. "We built an AI to outthink human instinct," she said, "and she made it late to its own fight." A flicker, almost a smile, touched Lee's lips. "It learned my first move," she said, "so I stopped offering it the second." Boyd let out a breath, half laugh, half surrender. "Well, that'll rewrite some manuals." Sloane's hands trembled on the console. She wasn't afraid, she was reverent. Briggs appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, his usual authority stripped down to something humbler. "Corporal," he said, voice rough, "my words earlier were out of line." Lee looked at him, no judgment, no victory. "Acknowledged," she said quietly. "We all have different missions." The simplicity disarmed him. He nodded once, "Thank you for more than one thing." When he left, no one filled the silence he left behind. Outside, the base moved on. Radios murmured. Engines idled. Soldiers carried stories they didn't know how to tell. "Spectre," they whispered in the mess. The bruised corporal in the simulator, she was Spectre. The word carried weight again, not myth, not rumor, reverence. Hensley turned back to the window, watching the reflection of his own face beside the lights of the hangar. The Omega chamber sat dark and silent now, a machine that had learned humility. He spoke softly, to no one in particular. "This will ripple." Lee's response was calm. "I understand, sir." "I'll contain what needs containing," he said, "but I won't bury what needs honoring." For the first time that night, her voice held something gentler. "Thank you." Boyd cleared his throat. "General, the Hill going to call. The press will smell this like blood if Spectre's name leaks." "It won't," Hensley said. "Not because we're hiding shame, because we don't spend legends like currency." He turned back to Lee. "You're dismissed, Corporal." She hesitated, hand tightening slightly on her helmet. "Sir, the technician is he." "Fine," Sloan said quickly. "Burned pride, good vitals." Lee nodded once. "Good." She turned to leave. Before stepping through the door, she glanced back, not with emotion but with quiet acknowledgement. "Permission to return to duty." "Granted," Hensley said. 700 debrief with Captain Sloan." "Roger." The door closed softly behind her. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. No one in the room spoke for a long time. The green light of the monitor faded to neutral, blank, unfeeling, as if it hadn't just exposed the truth of a ghost. Briggs's voice broke the silence first. "Sir," he said, hesitant, "if I may." "Go ahead." "I've trained a lot of fine soldiers," Briggs said, his voice stripped of bravado. "And I've seen fear dress itself up as confidence more times than I care to count. But today, I saw the opposite." Hensley nodded once. "So did I." Sloane's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated, then shut the terminal down. The screen obeyed, returning to a sterile login as if nothing remarkable had happened. But they all knew better. Machines forget on command, people shouldn't. Outside, the base lights dimmed one by one. Lee walked the corridor alone, her boots soft against the metal floor. The notebook rested in her pocket again, the one that read, "Targets aren't enemies. They're equations." She didn't need to look at it anymore. The lesson lived in her hands, in the silence between her heartbeats. At the far end of the hall, a group of young soldiers fell silent as she passed. They didn't speak, didn't salute. They just moved aside, quiet and unsure of what respect looked like anymore. When the door closed behind her, their voices rose hushed, reverent, cautious. "She's Spectre." "No way." "You saw her move." "Yeah, I saw." Back in the command office, Hensley stood by the window, cap in his hands. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "When I was a captain, I saw a man hold a line no one believed could be held. Years later, I found his name redacted, buried in a file that didn't belong to me. Today feels like that again." He placed the cap back on the desk, eyes following the corridor outside where Lee had disappeared from view. Some truths are too heavy for orders, too sacred for reports. All you can do is witness them. The narrator's voice lowers, reflective, almost reverent. "The military buries its ghosts well, but some ghosts refuse to stay gone. They wear new ranks, new names. They walk through our hallways bruised but unbroken, waiting for the moment the world remembers what silence looks like in uniform." Outside, the wind carried dust across the hangar doors, whispering against the steel like a secret the desert promised to keep. And somewhere deep in the compound, Corporal Lee Monroe, Spectre, cleaned her rifle in silence, while the night learned how to breathe again. Sometimes dawn doesn't feel like light. It feels like judgment. When the sun rose over Meridian Base the next morning, it didn't bring warmth. It brought silence, the kind that lingers after something sacred has happened. The desert wind brushed across the hangar yard, carrying grains of sand that shimmered in the pale light. A formation of soldiers stood assembled, boots aligned, faces unreadable. No one had ordered it. They'd just come, unspoken, voluntary, drawn by something none of them could quite name. They said it was a routine inspection. But everyone knew that wasn't true. At the far end of the yard stood the Omega chamber, scorched, patched, its metal skin reflecting the orange haze of morning. The same place that had almost become a tomb now stood as quiet witness. Lee Monroe walked across the open field, her uniform pressed, the bruise along her jaw fading to a shadow. She carried her helmet at her side, fingers curled around it like an anchor. The whisper of movement followed her, heads turning as she passed. No salute yet. Just acknowledgement, the kind built not on rank, but on what someone has done. Captain Rachel Sloane waited by the control tower, datapad in hand. "Morning, Corporal," she said softly. "Morning, ma'am." "Sleep at all?" Lee's eyes drifted toward the distant horizon. "Enough." Sloane smiled faintly. "Good, because they've been waiting." Lee looked past her, the formation stretching across the hangar, dozens of faces, all watching, all waiting to see what would happen next. She sighed quietly. "I didn't ask for this." "Doesn't matter," Sloane said. "You earned it." From the observation platform above, General Hensley stood beside Colonel Boyd, his uniform immaculate, his expression distant. He looked tired not from lack of rest, but from the kind of realization that rearranges the world. Below them, the soldiers whispered. Briggs adjusted his cap, eyes fixed on Lee. Even the young technician, the one she dragged out of the simulation chamber, stood among them, one arm still wrapped in gauze. His gaze followed her like someone watching a myth become a person. A siren blared once, long and low. The ceremony began. Boyd cleared his throat, reading from the tablet in his hand. "Corporal Lee A. Monroe, report forward." Lee stepped out from the line. The sound of her boots echoed across the concrete. When she stopped, the silence that followed was complete, not rigid, not forced, but reverent. Hensley descended from the platform, his cap under his arm. He stopped in front of her. The two of them, soldier and general, faced each other in the kind of stillness that carried the weight of every unspoken truth. "You were never meant to be here," Hensley said quietly, just enough for her to hear. "Not on any roster, not in any file." "I know, sir." "And yet," he continued, "you saved this base from a system we built to replace human instinct." Lee's eyes met his. "I didn't save the base, I just refused to let it fail." His lips twitched, the faintest trace of a smile. "Sometimes that's all salvation is." He turned then, facing the formation. "Attention." Boots clicked in perfect unison. "This soldier," Hensley said, his voice carrying across the yard, "demonstrated discipline, courage, and self-control in circumstances no protocol could predict. The events of yesterday are classified, but what you need to know is this." He paused. "Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands still and waits for the world to catch up." The men and women before him didn't move. They just listened, really listened. Hensley turned back to Lee. "You taught this base something we forgot, that flesh and will still matter more than steel and code." He took a single step closer, voice dropping. "For actions above and beyond expectation, you have my respect." Then, without ceremony, without fanfare, a general saluted a corporal. The moment held like a breath suspended in amber. Sloane blinked, Boyd lowered his head, Briggs straightened his spine. And the formation, hundreds of soldiers followed suit. Every hand rose, every chin lifted. For the first time since her transfer, Lee Monroe stood not as an anomaly, not as a rumor, but as something rarer, a mirror the entire base could see itself in. Later, after the crowd had dispersed, the wind carried away the last echoes of boots and commands. Lee sat on the steps near the hangar, helmet resting beside her, eyes tracing the empty sky. Sloane approached quietly, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She passed one to Lee, then sat beside her. Hell of a morning, Sloane said. Lee smiled faintly. Never liked mornings. They like you, apparently. They drank in silence for a while. The base stirred around them, vehicles rumbling, distant voices calling orders, life returning to normal. But for both women, the world hadn't gone back to what it was. It couldn't. You ever think about quitting? Sloane asked suddenly. Lee stared into the distance. Every day. What stops you? Lee thought for a moment. The people who can't. Sloane nodded slowly, eyes soft. You mean Spectre? Lee didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. That evening, a faint knock echoed against the barracks door. Lee looked up from her bunk. The technician, Private Harlan, stood in the doorway, clutching a folded piece of paper. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "sorry to bother you." She waved him in. "At ease, what is it?" He hesitated. "After what happened yesterday, I just wanted to thank you. I know we're not supposed to talk about it, but—" Lee interrupted gently. "Then don't talk about it, just learn from it." He nodded, embarrassed. "Yes, ma'am, I found this when they were cleaning the chamber." He held out the paper. It was a page from a logbook, old, burned at the edges, half the text gone. At the top, in fading ink, were the words, SBECTRE Field Log 612. Lee took it carefully, thumb running across the blackened edge. Beneath the damage, one line was still legible. "If you survive, teach them what we learned, that fear is a compass, not a cage." She folded it silently and placed it inside her notebook. "Thank you, Private," she said. He hesitated. "Ma'am, is it true? Were you really?" Her eyes lifted to his, calm, steady. "Does it change what you learned?" He blinked, thinking, "No, ma'am." "Then it doesn't matter." He nodded slowly, smiled, and left. Night fell again. The base lights flickered on, one by one, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Lee sat by the window, the hum of machinery steady and soft behind her. Her reflection in the glass looked older, calmer. The bruise had almost disappeared. She opened the notebook again, the small, battered one that followed her everywhere. Inside, beside the old notes and equations, she wrote something new. "Sometimes the mission isn't to win. It's to remind the world why we still try." She closed the book and leaned back, eyes on the faint stars beginning to pierce the desert sky. Outside, General Hensley stood alone near the Omega chamber, his cap under his arm. He looked up at the same sky, his thoughts heavy but clear. "We built machines to measure precision," his voice murmured, "but they'll never measure grace." The narrator's voice softens, measured, almost like a prayer. That morning, a general saluted a bruised corporal. No cameras, no speeches. Just sunlight and silence and truth. And maybe that's how legends begin, not with glory, but with someone who refuses to turn away when it would have been easier. Some medals aren't pinned to uniforms. They live quietly, in the way others start to walk taller after watching you stand. The wind swept across the yard again, tugging at the flags overhead. Lee Monroe looked up, the faintest smile breaking across her tired face. She whispered to herself, not a vow, not a promise, just a truth finally spoken aloud. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The world doesn't like remembering what it can't control. By the next morning, Meridian Base felt colder, not in temperature but in tone. The celebration that had hung quietly in the air the day before was gone. What replaced it wasn't hostility. It was fear, quiet, administrative fear. Lee Monroe could feel it the moment she walked into the command wing. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Paperwork shifted hands faster. Eyes that used to meet hers now flicked away, polite but distant. It wasn't the soldiers, it was the system. Systems don't like variables that prove them wrong. She signed in at the security desk, the guard avoiding her gaze. "Morning, Corporal," he mumbled. "Morning," she replied softly. Behind him, a secure door slid open with a hiss. Captain Sloan stepped through, tablet in hand, her expression tight. "Command wants you in briefing room 3, she said. "Right now." "Understood." But Lee already knew the tone, the timing, the sudden formality. This wasn't a debrief, it was a containment. The room was smaller than it should have been. 3 men in dark suits sat across the table, the kind of men who didn't salute because they didn't have to. Behind them, the flag of the Strategic Oversight Council stood perfectly still, untouched by wind or conscience. General Hensley sat at the far end, arms folded, eyes unreadable. He looked like a man forced to sit at a table he didn't build. Lee entered quietly, helmet under her arm. Corporal Lee Monroe, reporting as ordered. "Have a seat," one of the suits said, Director Havern, according to the badge on his lapel. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll keep this brief." She sat, posture straight, calm. The hum of the air unit filled the silence. "Yesterday," Havern began, "you engaged an AI system during a live-fire malfunction, neutralized hostile drones, and prevented loss of life." "Yes, sir." "An admirable act," he said smoothly, "but a classified one." Lee's jaw tightened. "I understand." "I'm sure you do." He flipped through the folder before him, her file, but not the real one, a sanitized version. "The problem, Corporal, is that the data has already circulated. Officers spoke. Footage leaked. The term Spectre has been used." At that, the second man, older, sterner, leaned forward. Deputy Marcus read, "We'd like to ensure that term doesn't appear again. Not in reports, not in rumor, not in memory." The third, silent until now, added softly, "We're here to preserve operational stability, not mythology." Lee looked at each of them, her voice steady. "Mythology didn't save your technician yesterday." Hensley's head tilted slightly, a flicker of restrained satisfaction in his eyes. Havern's smile didn't break. "And yet mythology gets people asking the wrong questions. Questions about where you came from, about who authorized your training, questions we can't afford." "So what are you asking me to do?" Lee said. The room stilled. Red's voice was cold. "Stand down. Voluntary reassignment. File redacted under Tier 7 obscurity." "In other words," Sloan muttered from the back, "erase her." The director ignored her. "You'll receive full compensation and transfer benefits. You'll be taken care of." Lee's eyes lifted slowly from the table. "You want me to disappear?" "It's better that way," Red said, "for everyone." "No," Hensley said suddenly, his voice like gravel under pressure. "Not for everyone." The suits turned toward him. "General," Havern said carefully, "you've had a long and commendable career. Don't tarnish it by defending a variable you don't understand." Hensley leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Understand. I trained Spectre operators before you learned how to read clearance tags." The words hit the room like a shell detonation. Red bristled. "That program was shut down." "Then maybe you should have made sure it stayed buried," Hensley shot back. "Because the people you tried to erase, the ones you made, they're still out there cleaning up your mess." Havern's tone turned sharp. "Watch your tone, General." Hensley's gaze didn't move. "I'd say the same to you." The silence after that was electric. Lee sat still through it all, the kind of stillness that made men nervous. When the shouting quieted, she finally spoke. "If this is about control, I understand. You don't want the name to spread. Fine. But if this is about shame, that's not mine to carry." Havern blinked. "Excuse me." She looked at him, unflinching. Spectre wasn't a myth. It was a promise that when systems fail, people won't. You can erase files, but you can't unteach that. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Even the air unit seemed to stop humming for a heartbeat. Red's face hardened. "You will comply, Corporal. That's not a request." Hensley's eyes flicked to hers, a silent warning. "Choose carefully." Lee stood slowly. Her chair creaked against the tile. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Havern waved a hand dismissively. "If you must." Lee looked at each of them in turn. Her words came quiet, deliberate, every syllable cutting deeper than any rank could protect against. "You built machines to make decisions easier. You trained algorithms to imitate courage. But courage doesn't compute. It chooses. It breaks the pattern when it matters. And you can't code that because you're afraid of what it looks like. So you bury it. But I'm not your file. I'm not your project. I'm a soldier. And yesterday I did what you built me to do: survive. You can redact that, but you can't undo it." She paused. The quiet was almost unbearable. Then she saluted, not out of protocol, but defiance turned graceful. "Permission to return to duty, sir." Hensley broke the silence. "Granted." Havern's mouth opened to protest, but Hensley's stare shut him down before he could. Lee turned and walked toward the door. Her boots struck the floor like punctuation marks on a sentence she refused to rewrite. Sloane followed her out. When the door closed, the silence that remained was jagged. Red finally exhaled. "You've just compromised a classified containment." Hensley's voice came low and sharp. "No, I just refused to compromise a soldier." In the corridor outside, Lee walked fast, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of her boots. Sloane caught up, breathless. "You shouldn't have done that," Sloane whispered. Lee didn't slow. "I know. They'll retaliate. They already have." She stopped, turning toward Sloane. "You ever feel like the system trains you to be brave only until it scares them?" Sloane didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night the storm hit. Not weather, orders. The transfer papers came through, stamped reassignment pending, undisclosed location. A polite exile. The bureaucratic way of saying, vanish. Lee sat in her quarters, the letter open on the desk. Her rifle leaned against the wall, cleaned, oiled, ready. The notebook sat beside the letter, open to the burned page the technician had given her. Fear is a compass, not a cage. Her hand rested on the words for a long time. Then she stood, folded the letter carefully, and tore it in half. The wind from the cracked window lifted the pieces away, small white fragments dancing into the desert air. Outside, she found Hensley standing near the hangar again, cap off, staring at the horizon where dawn hadn't yet formed. He didn't turn as she approached. "They're pulling me out," she said quietly. "I know. Orders. Not mine." They stood in silence a moment longer. The desert stretched endlessly before them, cold and vast. Hensley spoke first. "You could go dark again, disappear. You've done it before." "I could," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then why not?" Her answer came soft. "Because I'm tired of ghosts winning." The old general smiled faintly, something proud, something sad. "You're going to make the suits nervous for the rest of their lives." "Good," she said. "Maybe they'll remember how it feels to sweat." He turned toward her finally, eyes glinting with something between respect and farewell. "Whatever happens next, don't let them convince you that silence is safety." Lee's reply was simple. "It never was." The narrator's voice lowers, quiet, deliberate, heavy with emotion. "Every institution fears what it can't label. But the truth doesn't need a label to exist. It just needs one person who refuses to vanish." They wanted her gone, a ghost again. But she had stopped running from her reflection. Because this time, the world had seen it, and no one could unsee what courage looks like when it refuses to hide. The desert wind picked up, carrying the torn fragments of her reassignment order across the sand, pieces of paper catching morning light before disappearing into the horizon. And somewhere in the distance, the hum of an aircraft warmed to life. Lee Monroe, bruised, quiet, unbreakable, walked toward it without looking back. Every exile begins with a lie. Lee Monroe's orders said temporary reassignment. They didn't say where, they didn't say why. Just coordinates, a flight window, a silence too loud to question. She boarded the transport at dawn, a single duffel, her rifle, her notebook. The ramp closed behind her with the finality of a door that doesn't promise return. No escort, no send-off, not even Hensley this time. The hum of the engines filled the hollow between her thoughts. Across from her sat two quiet MPs, helmets off, eyes trained on the floor. They weren't guards. They were witnesses, men told not to ask questions about what they were carrying. Lee rested her head back, eyes on the trembling light of sunrise through the fuselage window. She wasn't afraid, but she could feel the pattern again, the old rhythm of manipulation. Transfers, blackout orders, reclassification. It was happening again. Spectre was moving, only this time, she wasn't being called back. She was being erased properly. 3 hours later, the transport touched down at an auxiliary base, Outpost 17, somewhere in the Nevada desert. The air shimmered with heat, the sky hung low and white. The compound was small, contained, quiet, too quiet. An officer met her on the tarmac. "Corporal Monroe, welcome," he said. "You'll be assisting the AI Behavioral Calibration Unit." "Under whose command?" He smiled thinly. "Director Havern." Her stomach turned slightly. "I see." He handed her an access badge. "You'll be briefed at 1300. Until then, quarters are yours." "Understood." As she walked toward the low-roofed buildings, a memory uncoiled, the night before Spectre disbanded, when her commanding officer had whispered, "If they ever recall you, it won't be to honor you. It'll be to bury what you learned." And here she was, walking straight into the shovel's shadow. Her quarters were bare, a cot, a desk, a single mirror. She unpacked slowly, mechanical. Rifle on the wall, notebook on the table, the folded page from the technician tucked inside its cover like a promise that hadn't expired. At 1300 sharp, she reported to Briefing Room 9. Inside Havern. Same immaculate suit, same stillness. But now his smile was gone. "Corporal," he said, gesturing to a chair, "good to see you again." She sat. "You moved fast." He folded his hands. "Efficiency is the backbone of control, and control keeps peace." "Peace," she repeated softly, "or obedience?" He ignored the question. "You'll be pleased to know we've recovered the Omega system from Meridian. Minimal damage. We're rebuilding it here, improved, safer." Lee's eyes narrowed. "You're rebuilding the same system that nearly killed half your personnel." "Upgraded protocols," he said. "The AI will integrate human behavioral templates for improved decision prediction. You'll help provide the baseline." She leaned back. "You want to train the machine to think like a soldier." "Exactly." She shook her head. "No, you want it to think like Spectre." Havern's smile returned, slow, cold. "You're perceptive as always." "So that's what this is," she said. "You're reviving the program." "Not reviving, evolving." He stood, walking around the table. "Your actions at Meridian demonstrated something remarkable, human improvisation under cognitive duress. We can teach that, encode it, manufacture it." "You can't code instinct." "Maybe not," he said, "but we can approximate it." Lee's voice hardened. "You're not saving soldiers, you're replacing them." Havern stopped behind her. "Replacement is a necessary step toward perfection." She turned slowly, meeting his reflection in the dark glass behind them. "And what happens when your perfection decides it doesn't need you?" He didn't answer, he didn't have to. That night she couldn't sleep. The desert wind howled across the outpost like static in her mind. Somewhere beyond the barracks, the test hangar lights glowed, white, sterile, inhuman. She slipped out of bed, boots silent on the floor, and made her way toward the restricted sector. Her badge wouldn't work there, she knew that, but she also knew doors weren't the only way in. Spectre training wasn't about breaking locks, it was about reading them. She timed the camera rotation, slipped through a maintenance duct, and dropped silently into the lower lab corridor. Rows of terminals hummed in the dark. The smell of coolant and metal filled the air. At the far end, a wide glass window overlooked the new Omega unit. Her pulse slowed. Inside the chamber, not simulation drones this time, but replicas. Human silhouettes printed in polymer shells. Moving training mimicking. And on a central monitor, Project SPECTRE2, behavioral upload in progress. Source template, Monroe, LA. She stared. The data stream showed her own telemetry from the first simulation, heartbeat intervals, reaction times, targeting arcs, all copied, rewritten, fed into the machine's mind. They weren't studying her. They were cloning her decision-making. The machine was learning not just how she fought, but why. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her hand tightened into a fist. "You idiots." Behind her, a voice, "You shouldn't be here." Lee turned slowly. Sloan stood in the doorway, uniform unbuttoned, face pale under the harsh lights. "Rachel," Lee whispered, "they pulled you here too." Sloan nodded. "Transfer orders yesterday, same cover story." "Then you know what this is." Sloan's eyes darted toward the chamber. "They're not just copying you, they're integrating neural imprint sequences. That means they'll build soldiers who think like me," Lee said quietly, without ever asking if they should. Sloan stepped closer. "You need to walk away, Lee. They'll destroy you if you try to fight this." Lee's expression didn't change. "They already tried that once." She moved toward the console, scanning lines of code. "Help me pull a copy of the core dataset." Sloan froze. "That's treason." "No," Lee said, "that's insurance." Sloan hesitated for only a moment, then sighed and pulled a drive from her pocket. 2 minutes before the system audits connection logs. They worked fast. Data streamed, blue light flickering against their faces. Lines of Lee's past reflexes, instincts, algorithms of human courage reduced to code. When the transfer completed, Lee ejected the drive and slipped it into her pocket. Sloan whispered, "Now what?" Lee looked at the chamber one last time. The polymer replica turned its head slightly, like it felt her watching. Her own face reflected faintly in its glass eyes. "Now," she said softly, "we remind them what real looks like." By morning, the audit alarms had begun. Unauthorized data pull. File breach. Security review. Havern's voice crackled over the intercom. "Monroe, report to Central Control immediately." She didn't. Instead, she stood at the edge of the flight strip, desert wind tearing at her hair, the small drive glinting between her fingers. Sloan ran up behind her. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Lee looked out toward the horizon. "If I stay, they'll make me the blueprint for the next war." Sloan's voice shook. "And if you go?" Lee slipped the drive into her jacket pocket. "Then maybe I get to choose what war means." Sloan stared at her, half fear, half admiration. "They'll hunt you." Lee smiled faintly. "They'll try." A siren began to wail behind them, the sound of containment orders spreading. The outpost roared to life, boots pounding, engines starting. Lee started walking toward the old runway. Sloan grabbed her arm. "Lee, what's on that drive?" "Everything they don't deserve," she said, "and everything they'll never understand." Her tone softened. "If you hear my name again, pretend you don't." Then she let go and kept walking. The narrator's voice softens, carried by the hum of desert wind. They thought they could copy her courage. But courage isn't data. It doesn't upload, it bleeds, it decides. You can clone movement, you can replicate instinct. But you can't manufacture a conscience. The sun bled over the horizon sharp, red alive. Behind her, the outpost sirens echoed like ghosts remembering their own creation. And in that sound, Lee Monroe disappeared again, not as a fugitive, not as a myth, but as the one truth the system could never contain. Spectre wasn't a program. It was a person who refused to let perfection erase humanity. Every story ends twice, once when it's over, and once when someone finally understands why it happened. For Lee Monroe, the desert ended 3 days after she vanished. She walked through wind and silence, old coordinates burned into her mind. Not the kind you find on maps, the kind you can't forget even when you want to. The kind Spectre used to call ghost routes. The drive in her pocket held 312 terabytes of data, every secret meridian and Havern's new project tried to bury. Every lesson Spectre learned the hard way, and every mistake the system swore it had erased. At dusk, she reached the edge of a forgotten airfield, cracked tarmac, skeletal hangars half buried in sand. The wind carried faint echoes of the past, engines, laughter, the bark of training orders long turned to dust. This was where Spectre began, and where it had died. Or so they thought. Inside the old command bunker, the air was cool, dry, thick with the smell of rust and memory. Lee moved through the dark, flashlight cutting thin gold lines through forgotten corridors. Every step echoed like an apology to ghosts she didn't know she missed. At the central console, she set the drive down. The terminal flickered once, twice, then hummed back to life. An old logo appeared, Task Force SBECTRE. Its edges cracked, its light dim but still there. She connected the drive. Lines of data cascaded across the screen, new code overlaying the old, rewriting what was once erased. Not to resurrect it, to record it right. For years, Spectre had been the military's whispered failure, soldiers too effective, too unpredictable, too human. Now the system that replaced them wanted to bottle that humanity and feed it to machines. Not if she could help it. The data finished transferring. The terminal beeped softly. She opened the last file, a message she hadn't known she'd saved. Commander D. Hale, final log. If you're hearing this, it means Spectre has been erased but not gone. You can't delete willpower. You can only misplace it. If anyone finds this, remember, the mission wasn't survival, it was remembrance. Lee stared at the words, her throat tightening. I remember, she whispered. By the time the sun rose again, the horizon burned gold and copper. In the distance, dust. Engines. Pursued. They'd found her. 3 armored transports cut through the desert, drones circling above them like vultures. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker. Lee Monroe, stand down. You are in violation of federal secrecy protocols. She didn't reach for her rifle. She reached for her notebook. The last page still blank. She tore it free, folded it once, and tucked it under the console keyboard. Then she picked up her weapon and stepped outside. The wind whipped across the field, carrying the smell of ozone and dust. The first drone descended, scanning beams sweeping over her face. A second voice, Havern's, cold, confident. Corporal Monroe, you've done enough damage. Hand over the data. She squinted against the light. You already have it. What? The part you wanted to steal. My pattern, my reactions, my reflexes. You already built it. Then why run? Lee's answer came steady, low. Because I wanted you to see the one thing you couldn't copy. She raised her rifle, but not at them. At the old bunker. One round clean. It hit the fuel line. Fire rippled across the sand, racing toward the walls of the old Spectre facility. The outpost behind her erupted in flame. Stop her, Havern shouted. The drones locked on. Bullets tore through the air. Lee dove into the dirt, rolled, returned fire, not wild, not desperate. Each shot found its mark. Drones shattered midair, raining fragments of their own precision. The armored trucks opened fire. Dust exploded around her. Still, she moved, not like a soldier, not like a ghost, but like someone who understood that death wasn't the loss to fear. Forgetting was. The bunker collapsed behind her in a burst of white fire. Flames climbed into the dawn, carrying the last of Spectre's secrets skyward, uncontainable, untraceable. She fell to one knee, breath sharp, arm bleeding from a graze. The smoke surrounded her. The world blurred. But in the distance, another engine. A small one. A convoy from Meridian Base. And at its front, General Hensley. The dust parted. Hensley's vehicle screeched to a halt. He stepped out, weapon drawn, shouting, "Cease fire, cease fire." The drones hesitated. The soldiers behind them faltered. Havern's voice barked over comms. "Who authorized?" "I did," Hensley snapped, voice cutting through the static. "Stand down." The line went silent. The drones powered off one by one, collapsing into the sand. Lee lowered her weapon slowly. She looked up at him, soot across her face, eyes unbroken. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "I told you," Hensley said, walking closer. "Some truths are too heavy to bury alone." She exhaled, shaky but calm. "They'll call you a traitor." He smiled faintly. "They already have." The two stood there for a long time, the smoke rising around them, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The fire ate the last of the outpost's memory. But not its meaning. Hensley broke the silence. "You destroyed the data." "Not all of it," she said. He frowned. "Where's the rest?" Lee reached into her pocket and handed him the small drive, the one she'd taken. "This is everything they tried to make me forget, but not the code they wanted." He took it, understanding. "You left something behind." She nodded. "Enough for them to keep chasing, not enough to find what matters." He looked down at her notebook tucked under his arm. "And what matters?" Lee smiled softly. "That we're not perfect, that's the point." Later that day, the fires burned out. The remains of Outpost 17 smoldered quietly in the sun. The wind scattered what was left, papers, ashes, broken glass, across the desert. Lee sat beside the wreckage, her uniform torn, skin streaked with dirt. Sloane knelt beside her, patching her arm in silence. "Guess they won't be cloning anyone else," Sloane said. Lee winced, half smiling. "Give it time. Someone always thinks they can fix the human problem." Sloane glanced at her. "You don't think we can be better?" Lee shook her head slowly. "We can, but not if we forget what worse feels like." By nightfall, the military containment teams had arrived. Official statements would follow, half-truths written in perfect grammar. The incident would be labeled a containment breach. Lee's name wouldn't appear in any report. But in the corners of bases across the country, whispers began again. A story about a soldier who fought machines with nothing but instinct. About a corporal who stood down generals and lived by a code no algorithm could replicate. A story that didn't need documentation to survive. In his office weeks later, Hensley played the encrypted file Lee had left on his desk, the one titled Spectre Echo. Her voice filled the room, calm, even reflective. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone or finally free. Either way, the system's back to pretending it's safe again. Don't let them. Keep teaching the hard things, the quiet things. Tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that fear doesn't get to drive. Tell them Spectre wasn't built to win wars. It was built to remind the people fighting them why they still mattered." Hensley sat in silence after the message ended. Then he whispered, "Yes, ma'am." Outside, cadets trained on the range. One of them, a young woman, paused to wipe sweat from her brow. She tied a small black thread around her wrist, shaped like a falcon diving through shadow. Another cadet asked, "What's that mean?" The girl smiled. It means don't wait for permission to do what's right. He frowned. Who told you that? She shrugged. Someone who didn't exist. The narrator's tone fades into quiet reflection, like wind through a hangar door. They never built another Spectre unit, not officially. But you can't kill the idea that some people fight for something purer than orders, something that can't be taught, only remembered. Her name faded from files, her photo deleted. But the lesson stayed. In every soldier who looks at fear and decides to move anyway. Spectre was never a ghost, it was a mirror. And what it reflected was us. A final beat. The wind carries a whisper, half memory, half truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The screen fades to black.